Hey guys, we're gonna start. So thank you guys for coming out for LAUX's event tonight for Josh and Mauldin, conflict resolution for designers who hate conflict. I also want to recognize LA Adobe, Adam Bell over here, and where's Marcella? Oh, hey, okay, UXPLA. Thank you. And of course, I want to thank Pivotal for sponsoring and providing us food in the venue. It's very nice. If you haven't noticed, there's a ton of sandwiches, drinks, stuff on tap, water. Okay, so Josh is the transplant, new to LA.
Yeah.
He works here at Pivotal as a product designer. He is also an O'Reilly author.
Yeah.
And he also likes to tell dad jokes. So, all right, let's start the event.
Right.
There you go.
Thanks. Hello. How's it going? So, let's talk about conflict. This is one of my absolute favorite things to talk about. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. We'll break the talk down into 3 sections where we're talking about preparing for this conversation, actually having it, and then what to do when it inevitably goes sideways. Quick sound check. Can everyone hear me okay back there in the back? Yeah? Right on. I'm getting some thumbs up, so I feel pretty good about everything. Great. So, I would like to tell you about my experience with conflict. I'm very squarely in panic screeching territory most of the time. I wasn't really brought up to deal with conflict. It was very much a yes ma'am, yes sir kind of environment, and if you didn't like it, it's too bad. That did not prepare me well for working with other humans. So I was just a dude who would be in the background, seething with the nervous stomach and twitchy hands and eyes and losing sleep. And I realized it was not good for me. And it was also not good for the products that I was building, because I wasn't doing the best work that I could be doing because I wasn't effectively engaging in conflict. So I went through a lot of training, read a lot of books, talked to my therapist a couple of times, and now I'm at a point where I don't lose sleep over this kind of thing. I don't shrink from conflict. And what I want to share with you tonight is a few things that I've learned. This is not a prescription for things. This is just like you may find some things helpful in one conflict and not in another. Take what you can, please. So I really believe this about conflict. I think that it is one of the keys to building a really good product. And there was a Harvard Business Review article that talked about how the best performing teams thrive on conflict. And I've totally found that to be true firsthand. And I'll put a link to that at the end of the slides. I also like to talk about what this isn't. This is not a way to manipulate other folks. It's not a way to win an argument. This is more of a framework for having a conversation when it gets sticky. Again, like, there's no paint by numbers approach. There's no formula. You don't tick a bunch of boxes and then, oh, I had a successful conflict. So with that said, let's prepare for this conversation. So raise your hand if you've ever dealt with a situation that just sort of set your chest a-fluttering and you thought, I'd very much like to avoid this at all possible costs. Nice. So I'm super sorry that happened. But also, keep that in mind, and maybe some things that you pick up here could apply to conflicts like that in the future. The first thing that I would invite you to do is channel your inner ice cube and check yourself before you wreck yourself. And if you're wondering how to do that precisely, keep this in mind. This is called Hanlon's razor. And basically it says that I'm not going to make someone out to be a villain when they might have just made a mistake. I think that's important because this humanizes the other person when you're thinking like this, and it helps declaw a lot of the stories that we tell ourselves about other people. I stole this from Cat Watkins, and this is another thing that I use when I'm trying to figure out, do I want to have this conversation or not? Like, how strongly do I feel? If I'm like a 1 out of 10, maybe I let it ride. If I'm a 10 out of 10, I'm definitely going to go for it. And if you're super nerdy, you can use the Fibonacci scale. Why not? When I've had more serious conversations, I have done this thing called an accusation audit. And essentially what it is I'm listing out all of the bad things that someone can say about me or the situation. And this is really helpful in anticipating how my counterpart's going to react, what they might say. And it also is one of those things where if I need to, I can lead off with something from this accusation audit to kind of take the sting out of something that's potentially sticky. So now we're going to talk about what actually happened versus our interpretation of what happened. You want to separate your facts from your stories. The facts are these things that are objective, observable, they happened, they're irrefutable, unless you're into alternative facts, and if that's the case, this talk's not for you. When you talk about stories, these are how the facts affected us, how it impacted our ability to work or have agency. And when we're having conversations, we always want to start with the facts, because this builds a foundation on the conclusions that you're drawing, and it helps the other person figure out where your head went. So here's an example of something that I wrote down around a teammate that had a pattern of committing me to design decisions that I didn't approve of, didn't have a chance to weigh in on, kept adding me to meetings when I was booked for something else. And what I'd like for you to do is take a second, give this a read, and see if you can pick out what the facts are versus what the story is. And I'm going to get some water while you do that. Excellent. Okay, so here's how it breaks down. I'm taking out all the story, and what I'm left with is my teammate committed me to a design I didn't make, and they're adding me to meetings without consulting me or my schedule. And one of the reasons that I think this is important is that if you want someone to get less defensive when you talk to them, be able to pull the facts out from the stories. And I touched on this just a moment ago. Figure out if this is a pattern or if this is just a one-off experience. Just because it's a one-off experience doesn't mean you don't need to address it. But if you can spot a pattern, it really helps make a more effective argument by pointing to several examples where this kind of behavior happened in the past. Also, just like with any other good project, you want to have goals. And before you go into this conversation, figure out what it is that you need to get out of it. So it may be that you need agency in what you do. Maybe you need people to stop texting you about work after work. It's whatever you need. And if you're new to this kind of thing, I encourage you to write it down. You can take it with you into the discussion, and if things start to go sideways, you can refer back to that and refocus the conversation. So to recap, figure out where you are on this sliding scale, and if you're checking yourself before you wreck yourself, figure out what stories you might be telling yourself, what possible things could they say about you, separate your facts from your stories, figure out if this is a pattern, and then make sure that you have some goals for this conversation. So that's it. Let's do it. So we're going to go have this conversation. It's important to keep in mind that this could be a really stressful thing for you and for the other person. So one of the things that I do is I ask for permission to have this conversation. And I do that by going up to them and asking things like, hey, are you super busy? Hey, is this a bad time? And it gives them a chance to say no. And if they're not in a place where they can talk to me, it's good to know. And depending on the situation, I might lead off with something from my accusation audit, like, you're going to say I'm not a team player when I say this. Hear me out, though. this is going to be one of those things that prevents defensiveness. And once they've agreed to have a conversation, pull out the facts. Remember that these are the least incendiary parts of your conversation, so lead with them and then show what conclusions you drew. So when you tell your story, again, talk about how this affected you. And when you're doing this, I think it's really important to avoid very concrete, decisive language. Like, speak tentatively. Say, like, it seems like, or it looks like, or it sounds like. And it prevents the other person from becoming super defensive, because they can come back and a little more logically talk about what you thought. And if you're seeing a theme here about defensiveness and deterring it, it's really intentional. When you're defensive, you're not open to hearing what the other person has to say. Your adrenaline is pumping, and like you're just like retreating into your lizard brain, and your fight, flight, freeze response is being activated, so you won't be able to really have a conversation or hear anyone. This is not about watering down what you're saying or beating around the bush. By all means, please be very direct in these conversations. So once you've stated the facts, you've told your story, ask them how they see it. Open it up to them. And once you do that, make sure that you ask open-ended questions. And a few examples of this are listed here on the left and right. You'll notice that all the open-ended questions start with what and how and can. None of them include why, and that's intentional because why is a trigger word for getting defensive. So if you can get the point across with your question by asking what or how, it's going to keep someone in the discussion and keep them from diving into the lizard brain. So, you've had your initial volley, you presented the most solid argument possible, but maybe this person is getting a little defensive, launching into a bad faith argument, whatever. It's completely fine, because I'm going to share some tips that will just make that not really matter as much. These tools are designed to foster empathy between the two of you and help you get to the core of the issue. The first one is called mirroring, and this is a much more refined approach to active listening. Essentially what it is you're repeating the last word or important phrase that someone said. So the benefit is you're using their own words, which shows that you're hearing them, and if you need to, you can use them to help get some clarification. So an example could be if someone says to me, hey, I wish you wouldn't be such a diva about these things. It's always been this way. I've always committed people to meetings without looking at their calendar. My response could be, a diva? And just let it hang. Count to 5 before you say anything. Let them fill that silence and let them come back to you. Labeling is very much the same way. What you're doing is you're just summarizing what someone said. So in that statement where someone is telling me not to be a diva, I could respond with, it seems like you care more about doing things the way that they've always been done, even if it's at the cost of productivity. And again, don't fill the silence. Let them come back and talk to you. So if you don't have any time to prepare for this conversation, you have someone come at you, or there's no time for prep, make sure to take liberal advantage of your mirrors and labels and bring in that sliding scale that we talked about earlier. See how strongly they feel versus how strongly you feel and try and work it out. And one of my favorite things to do when someone is asking for something that's absolutely ludicrous is to ask them, how am I supposed to do that? Or how is that supposed to work? And that saves me from having to do all the emotional labor of, filling out what they're trying to say. It lets them do the work for me. So to recap, make sure that you ask for permission to have this conversation, lead with the facts, tell your story, ask for their input, and when you're going back and forth with them, use those mirrors and labels and how am I supposed to do that to help you out. So, it's not going so well. And despite the super cool argument that you've laid out that you could have argued with the Supreme Court and it would have won, this person is just not having it. So to have an effective conversation, everyone has to have psychological safety. And you can tell when the safety might be at risk by thinking about the spectrum of behavior. So on one end of the spectrum, you have people who are withdrawn, give very terse responses, maybe they're shaky and trembling. And at the other end, you've got folks who can be super abrasive, maybe they're yelling, maybe they're throwing things, pounding their fists. It is completely okay to exit a conversation if someone is too abrasive. Please don't ever feel like you have to stay in it. And if that is the case and someone doesn't really feel safe, one of my absolute favorite things to do is use what's called a contrasting statement. So a lot of folks become angry because they think that maybe we're missing the point or they're being attacked. This is a perfect opportunity to bring it back. So you could tell the other person, hey, I'm not saying that you're a terrible person. I'm saying that I need agency in how I work. Committing me to these meetings hinders what I have been hired to do. So it's a perfect way to think about those goals that you had earlier and pull the conversation back to where you need it to go. So I think a lot about Ghostbusters for some reason, sometimes for no reason. But when I think about conflicts, a lot of times I notice that we all want the same things, but we're coming at it from opposing angles. So it's a lot like crossing the streams early on in the first Ghostbusters movie. And when that happens, this is a really good opportunity to take a step back and say, hey, we want the same thing here. We both want to deliver this project on time and on budget. Let's figure out how we can get there together. Sometimes your definition of good is different than another person's definition of good. Like a project manager could care mostly about time and budget. An engineer may care more about all of their tests passing or no crashes. And a designer may care about can someone complete this flow or does this match the brand? Just keep that in mind as you're having these conversations. And even if it's still failing, know that this is a possibility and that will definitely reduce your stress. It's totally fine to walk away. One thing that I've done when I've had to exit these conversations is I will say something like, hey, it seems like we're at an impasse. We can't work this out between each other. We need to, so let's involve our bosses or our managers or things like that. Lastly, sometimes you can do everything possible to have a good conversation, but you just need to deliver a tough message to someone. And if you have to do that, ask for permission to have a conversation, state your facts, and then say what needs to be said. So if it's, we've talked about this 3 times, you've done it 3 more times since then, this is what has to happen. They probably won't like it, but again, sometimes there's no other way around it. So to recap about when things go wrong, do a safety check. See where everyone stands in the conversation. Use contrasting statements, call back to your mutual purpose, and you can also bring back that how am I supposed to do that line from earlier. That's going to be really helpful. And sometimes just know that you have to deliver a tough message, and they might not like it. And while these conversations can be very frustrating and draining and you might feel like you failed, I would invite you to see it from a different angle. It's that you are a person like me who hates conflict, wants to do better, and went to have this conversation with someone with these tools. And I think that makes you a badass. So keep that in mind. And as an epilogue, I have 3 links to share with you. The first one is called Never Split the Difference. This is a book by a former FBI hostage negotiator. I pulled things like mirroring and labeling from that book into here. It's a very tactical way of dealing with conflict, and it's one of the best books on conflict I've read. You've also got Crucial Conversations, which is really good for training. The book's a bit dry, but it has some gems in there to help you out. And lastly, we've got that Harvard Business Review article about high-performing teams thriving on conflict. If you want to keep in touch, here's my info. I'm on Twitter. There are a lot of dad jokes there, so just be warned. If you want to keep the conversation going, pop over to the LAUX Slack or hit them up on Twitter. And
hey Josh,
thank you.
Are you on Instagram too?
Yep. Yes, Joshua Mauldin as well.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I'm there. So thank you all very, very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can ask them here, or you can come find me one-on-one after I leave. Any questions? Yes.
So among the conversations that failed,
Yeah.
in your experience, has any of them affected your career?
No, thank goodness.
Are you afraid?
What's that?
Are you afraid that it might happen?
I'm not afraid of that because I'm just going to do the best that I can do, and if something happens and it affects my career, I'll deal with it at that time. Which may not be the most prepared thing to do, but...
Hey Josh, could you repeat the question? Or answer it? It's a little, volume's a little...
Oh, sure. Okay, so the question was, what about the conflicts that failed? Did I feel like they endangered my career? Is that a fair way of interpreting it? Okay, awesome. Yes?
How often do you have these conflicts?
You'll have small scale ones almost all the time. Like, for example, I was working with the UX architect at a previous gig. We both had different ideas on what the user flow should be. So we would pull out things like that sliding scale to see how strongly we felt about it. But I've had larger scale conflicts that involved people who were really micromanaging me, or people that I managed that were really underperforming, and I had to have these hard conversations.
Are these like clients or?
Most of the conflicts happen with teammates, also family members, but mostly teammates. You can still use what you find here in talking with clients or talking with people who are above you. I would just advise you to not do anything that might be career limiting. You may have to change your tack a little bit when speaking with someone else who's above you, but like, don't water down your message at all. Hey.
Like you mentioned, you know, high-performing teams tend to deal well with conflict. How do you, I guess, spread that knowledge of how to deal with conflict within the team so the whole team can be, you know, can potentially be high-performing if they know how to deal with it?
There are a few ways of doing it. So at my last gig, what I did was after yes, hey, I'm sorry. You're going to have to keep reminding me to repeat the questions. What was the question?
How do you teach a team to understand how to deal with conflict so they could potentially be a much more higher performing team?
How do you teach teams to deal with conflict? One of the things that I've done is I've actually done a workshop with a group of folks at my old gig to say like, hey, listen, if conflict weirds you out, here's what you can do, here's how to have these conversations. Another thing is like we all need to make sure that we have an open environment, so if someone does have a differing opinion, don't shut them down, always engage in the conversation, because generally people are seeing it a different way than you do, and there's a lot you can find between the two of you. Hey.
Is there a reason you wanted to, like, might want to start a conversation off with the, like, accusation audit and saying, like, you're probably going to say this, like, would that, to me it feels like you might be kind of boxing the conversation into a certain path, but are there, like, what are the advantages of doing that?
Sure, so when do you want to use an accusation audit? When is it beneficial? I've used them in more serious conversations, like with someone having performance review issues. It doesn't quite, I don't see it as boxing the conversation, but it does provide a little bit of a frame to say like, hey, just in case you're gonna go that direction in your head, let me just try and like head that off at the pass. But it still leaves the road open to have that conversation and have that back and forth. Yes?
Do you know if these slides will be available?
The slides will definitely be available. Yeah, I'm going to tweet out a link, and I'm hoping that we can get it in the Slack channel as well. Yes?
From a team management perspective, sometimes it's necessary to have the sort of like a creative tension. So, how from your experience, what has worked best to maintain that creative tension, but not break down the team? For example, you know,
Sure.
what advice do you have, perhaps, to like, keep things moving forward? Everybody gets an opportunity to voice their differences, and you know, still make it to the next sprint, for example. What's your
Sure. So
advice?
how to keep some healthy tension without people losing their minds before the sprint's over. All right. Make sure that everyone feels psychologically safe. So like I mentioned a moment ago, like don't shut someone down when they have a differing opinion. Dive into it. Figure out where they're coming from. Another thing that I found really helpful in getting people to feel a little more safe and a little more open is something that Napoleon used to do with his generals. And he would let the least ranking person speak first, and the highest ranking people would speak last. So it was a very good way of getting everyone's input without having voices that might dominate the room, so to speak. Yes?
Well, one more question. I guess a lot of this kind of seemed to focus on like if you have a difficult conversation with someone, are there any like kind of tweaks or changes you would make if you need to facilitate a conversation between two people who might be having issues with one another?
Yeah, so what would happen if you have to facilitate a conversation with multiple people instead of having a one-on-one? A lot of the things that are here can definitely apply. We need to spend a lot more time with mirrors and labels and making sure that psychological safety is still there so that they can have that open back and forth. And if you see someone is going to a place where they're not feeling safe, pull in those contrasting statements and say like, you know, this person is not saying this, and let them explain and continue that way. Yes?
So what if the conflict is occurring in a remote team?
What is happening if the conflict is happening on a remote team?
Yes. Is there any suggestions for opening a conversation on Slack or online?
Yeah, it's best if you can have these conversations in real time, so a voice chat over Slack or a video chat would be great because most of our communication is nonverbal, and so if you can just see what someone is doing, it's a lot easier to have that conversation with them. But if that's not an option, you just have to work a little harder when you're typing to them to make sure that like things that you say aren't going to get misinterpreted. One of the things that I find really helpful is I'll make sure to put emojis in there just to say like, okay, cool, I don't hate you, everything is fine. But yeah, you have to work a little harder on safety to make sure that folks don't misinterpret. Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
All right, thank you guys for coming. So we have a Slack channel.
It's LAUXmeetup.com/Slack.
Okay, you didn't hear that. No, it's LAUXmeetup.com/Slack.
Yep, Slack.
So you can join on there. It's open to everybody. And
How much time do we have for the space? Like another 30, 40 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, could they do some sort of maybe group talk? Like could the people stay a little bit longer and maybe talk about their own experiences at work and stuff? Like a little mini therapy session?
Yeah, so if you want to hang out and talk about, that's way better.
yeah.
If you want to hang out and talk about stuff, yeah, you're welcome to hang out here for a bit longer. I think that we need to clear out by around 8:30.
Okay.
Hi, person in the back. Yes. Oh shoot, Barry's following me? Nice! I did not know that. I feel super good about all of my life choices right now. Hey.
Is Pivotal hiring?
Wow, we always want to talk to cool people, so if you are interested in a position here, come find me. I have a ton of business cards that I'm totally willing to give out, and I'd love to chat with you. Thanks for asking. Yes? Pivotal is the only person that is hiring.
What's your company?
Philosophy.
Oh, philosophy. That's philosophy, of course.
I have a question.
Yeah, hiring for what?
Relating
sure.
your presentation.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
I just want to know. So, I don't mean to put you in the spot, but can you actually tell us like a real life experience that you probably experienced in which conflict was not, you didn't find a solution right away, and how that was challenging for you?
Oh, sure.
Like
Yeah.
you know, like a very practical experience. Because I
Yeah.
feel like that can help us a lot to
Sure.
understand all the theory.
So I'll tell you a story about a project I was working on. It was a retail app for iOS and Android. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we found that, when you launch an app, sometimes they ask to send you push notifications. And 99% of people are like, nope, don't want it. So we found that by putting a screen up before you see that dialogue that presents the value of this choice, like, hey, these push notifications can help you know when your order ships, things like that, you'll have a much higher opt-in rate. The engineer that I was working with refused to implement that that screen before that alert popped up. And so I was having a conversation with them to figure out, like, hey, where is this coming from? And they just were feeling like they weren't being heard. So I tried lots of like mirrors and labels and digging into it. And what it came down to was they were just digging their heels in. They didn't want to do it that way. They weren't going to do it. I couldn't make them do it.
There was no like valuable reason why?
Their reason was Apple's human interface guidelines don't explicitly call that out, so I'm not going to do it. So I'm like, okay, fine, I get where you're coming from. But we went back and forth for probably about 20 minutes, and then I realized, like, this guy is not going to give an inch. We're not going to be able to go anywhere. So I mentioned, like, hey, seems like we're at an impasse. Let's involve both of our managers, and we'll work it out. Like, I still want to work this out with you. We just need some extra help. It ended up with his manager getting involved, my manager getting involved, and I was asked to never talk to him about it again. So we did it. Yeah. So
That is a good reason.
yeah, it was a very interesting, very tense time.
It is.
All right, come find me if you have more questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.